Edward Vance watched his signed compliance memo slide out of the central copy room shredder like gray confetti at 12 minutes past 8 in the morning. His legal signature had been sliced into narrow curls, and the bold subject line regarding mandatory vendor data retention was chewed into silent dust. The industrial machine hummed with steady indifference. No one in the hallway blinked. A facility worker casually emptied the catch bin into a heavy, clear plastic bag, knotted the top, and rolled his utility cart toward the freight elevator. Edward stood 3 paces away with his morning coffee cooling in his hand, feeling a small, clean click inside his chest, the precise sound a seatbelt latch makes when it locks into place. It was simply the quiet realization that something long in motion had finally reached its point of no return. He straightened the stack of blue folders in his arms the way he had every morning for 18 years, ensuring the edges aligned perfectly and the tab labels faced outward before walking back to his workstation. For nearly 2 decades, Edward had maintained his cubicle as an island of disciplined order on a floor that worshipped rapid momentum and flashy quarterly slides. He kept a mechanical label maker beside 3 distinct highlighters and a neat row of black fine-point pens. His digital calendar resembled a tightly woven quilt, filled with recurring risk assessments, third-party vendor audits, and a monthly lessons learned seminar that he hosted even when only 2 junior analysts attended. People on the floor called him a hall monitor behind his back. Senior managers would smile warmly to his face and say his thoroughness was remarkable, using the exact tone reserved for a neighbor who alphabetized their garage tools. Edward remained entirely unbothered. The duty of a senior risk officer at Apex Financial Technologies was remarkably simple if performed without ego. You inspect the foundational structure, document the hairline cracks, and gently nudge enthusiastic executives back onto legal ground. If he remained invisible, it meant the firm stayed off regulatory warning lists and out of federal courtrooms. That was the unwritten arrangement, and Edward was content with invisible. The acquisition whispers began as casual lunchroom rumors in January, before hardening into mandatory calendar invitations by late March. Sleek consultants in tailored suits strolled through the carpeted halls, holding their hands clasped in front of their waists. Corporate slides bloomed with ambitious phrases such as operational synergy, runway expansion, and friction-free transition. An aggressive digital countdown clock appeared on the company intranet homepage, ticking down the days until the merger with Vanguard Global Holdings was finalized. Every department head scrambled to polish their metrics, burying unresolved liabilities beneath glowing forecasts. Edward adjusted his workflow accordingly. His compliance memos stripped away unnecessary adjectives and gained sharp bullet points. He clipped detailed system, attached official policy citations, and highlighted federal compliance guidelines using plain language. This policy deviation will trigger substantial regulatory penalties. This technical bypass exposes customer data to unauthorized foreign servers. This action directly breaches our fiduciary duty under federal standards. In response to his urgent warnings, Edward received polite dismissals and cheerful emojis. The director of operations, Julian Mercer, frequently replied with a simple thumbs-up icon or a cartoon fire symbol. Edward printed one of those fire responses and clipped it inside a private file, labeled Executive Acknowledgements, just to remind himself of the absurd reality surrounding him. Despite the growing apathy, Edward remained intensely loyal to his professional oath. He appreciated a steady paycheck, but he cared far more about the underlying principle that if a professional performed the right actions day after day, the firm's ethical floor would remain solid. He arrived at 6:30 every morning and left long after the sun had set, his shoulders stiff from decades at a keyboard. When junior managers ignored his compliance tickets, he resubmitted them with additional citations. When department leads rolled their eyes during risk reviews, he smiled politely and continued reading the policy line items. It was pure muscle memory built across 25 years in financial oversight. He lived by strict personal standards: never issue a memorandum you would be embarrassed to read under oath, and never use words like minor when describing systemic risk. The initial red flag appeared small enough to be mistaken for an administrative oversight. A standing weekly meeting labeled Controls. Deep Dive suddenly vanished from Edward's calendar, only to reappear as a restricted private event with attendee names hidden. When Edward sent a query to the coordinator, he received a cheerful response, explaining that they would sync up with him later, punctuated by two bright exclamation points that functioned like cheap room spray, offering a strong scent but doing nothing to clean the air. Edward immediately recorded the interaction in his personal log. 3 days later, a vital compliance directory on the network grew suspiciously thin. On Monday morning, his active vendor exception folder contained 114 verified files. By Wednesday afternoon, the number dropped to 96. When he questioned the administrator, he was informed that operations was performing standard housekeeping prior to the diligence audit. Edward thanked the administrator, returned to his desk, and pulled the server audit trail from memory. He examined one deleted entry, a critical cybersecurity addendum for a vendor transmitting unencrypted records overseas every evening after 10 o'clock. Outdated exception, the system tag now read, stamped with the digital signature of a newly hired ops lead. Legal counsel Genevieve Reed also began behaving as though the floor were covered in wet ink. Genevieve stopped sending written replies entirely. Instead, she began calling Edward directly on his personal mobile phone, opening every conversation with a soft phrase suggesting they talk off the record. By the third unrecorded call, it felt like throwing a heavy wool blanket over a smoke detector. Whenever Edward hung up, he opened a plain text file and timestamped the entry with meticulous precision. April 10th, 9:02 in the morning. Phone conversation with General Counsel Genevieve Reed. Storage security exception discussed. Verbal authorization granted for temporary non-compliance. Written documentation explicitly deferred. Edward preserved these text entries in a secure local directory. He had never been a bitter man, but he was a firm believer in keeping complete historical drafts. During an afternoon walkthrough with the Operations Committee, framed as a casual alignment session, Edward distributed a single-page compliance checklist titled Non-Negotiable Risk Controls prior to closing. The document featured signature lines at the bottom for compliance, operations, legal, and risk management. A junior operations analyst squinted at the page and asked if physical signatures were necessary when email approvals existed. Julian Mercer, standing by the glass whiteboard in a custom-tailored dark blazer, smiled broadly with all his teeth showing. "We are streamlining our workflow," Julian announced. "No loose ends, no bureaucratic friction." Several attendees chuckled as if Julian had delivered a sharp joke. Edward felt a cold, silent tide pull back somewhere deep inside himself. He smiled back, because smiling is what an experienced professional does when an executive insists the weather is clear while dark thunderheads gather on the horizon. Later that afternoon, Edward sat in a regional strategy presentation where a marketing VP displayed a slide titled Clean Transition, Zero Legacy Debt. Edward felt his chest tighten. Legacy debt was a marketing euphemism printed on party balloons to float past heavy liabilities. Edward raised his hand and measured a question regarding how unresolved vendor liabilities would be disclosed during final diligence. The presenter thanked Edward for his input and transitioned to a slide about brand alignment. Edward swallowed the heat in his chest, opened his notebook, and wrote, "We do not alter historical facts to create prettier corporate narratives." By Friday afternoon, Edward's name was silently removed from another critical meeting invitation, titled Merger Diligence. Synergy Readiness. He discovered the exclusion because he maintained a physical desk calendar in a slim blue binder as a direct shadow to his digital schedule. A faint pencil rectangle had marked the diligence meeting for 3 weeks, yet the digital calendar on his screens was completely blank for that time slot. When he inquired with the meeting organizer, he received an automated response stating that management preferred to keep the working group compact. Edward noted the exact phrasing in his paper binder and drew a precise box around it with his black pen. Shortly after lunch, Toby Miller, a junior analyst recently hired to support compliance oversight, hovered behind Edward's chair, asking what the absolute shortest version of the quarterly risk register would look like. Edward opened the database on his screen and let the young man see the thousands of itemized entries. Toby asked if they could compress the file into a 3-bullet summary deck for the board. Edward looked Toby in the eye and replied that there was a detailed version that complied with federal statutes, and a condensed version that would leave the board vulnerable to immediate shareholder litigation. Toby's eager smile faltered. Edward pointed directly to a line item, detailing an unhedged foreign exchange exposure. If we pretend this obligation does not exist, we accept full institutional liability, Edward said in a quiet tone. Ignoring the truth now will cost 20 times more than resolving it properly. Toby nodded politely and walked away. Edward ate his lunch at his desk, reading 3 pages of a paperback he kept in his lower desk drawer. His personal phone vibrated with a text message from a longtime auditor in finance, warning him that operations was reclassifying all of Edward's data retention findings as non-binding advisory notes. Edward stared at the screen before typing a simple response. "Thank you for the notification. Document everything on your end." At 4 minutes past 3 in the afternoon, legal counsel's executive assistant sent a calendar placeholder for a quick sync regarding tone. Edward accepted and walked to a glass-walled conference room. The assistant cleared her throat and explained that executive leadership wanted internal compliance language to reflect optimistic energy. Suggesting terms like policy violation and breach of contract felt unnecessarily aggressive. Edward pressed his thumb into the plastic cap of his pen until his thumbnail turned white. "Words like violation and breach are legal definitions," Edward explained. "If leadership is uncomfortable with the terminology, the appropriate solution is to remediate the non-compliant condition." The assistant asked if he could replace those terms with operational variances. Edward thought of his shredded memorandum in the basement bin. "I will continue utilizing the precise legal definitions mandated by corporate governance," he replied. When the meeting concluded, Edward timestamped the conversation and logged the event into his private record. Late that same evening, Julian Mercer stopped by Edward's cubicle and placed an insulated water bottle on the desk. "Thank you for the extraordinary dedication, Edward," Julian said softly, leaning over the partition. "We value your meticulous nature, but we must exercise extreme discretion regarding what we commit to written records. Let us keep the momentum moving forward without unnecessary impediments." Edward offered a calm smile. "The organization functions far more reliably when every structural bolt is tightened to spec," Edward replied. Julian chuckled quietly, patted the partition, and remarked that Edward would be fine. In Edward's long experience, when an executive assured you that you would be fine, it invariably meant someone had quietly shifted the safety line. That night, Edward packed his leather briefcase and paused. On his left monitor, a draft compliance memorandum sat open, featuring 4 detailed bullet points, specific server timestamps, and links to internal frameworks. He saved the file to the central server and sent it to the compliance committee. He opened his physical blue calendar and inked a small black dot in the bottom right corner of the day's square. As he walked toward the elevator, he passed the central copy room and glanced at the heavy shredder bag swollen with paper strips. He pressed the elevator button. A sales director stepped inside beside him and asked if Edward was excited for the merger announcement. Edward looked at their twin reflections in the steel doors. "I am completely prepared for it." The following is Monday at 6:47 in the morning. Edward encountered his first access denied screen while attempting to log into the corporate retention compliance dashboard. He refreshed the browser, but a bold red banner flashed. Unauthorized access level. Contact System Administrator. Edward took a sip of his coffee, opened the IT ticketing system, and typed a formal inquiry requesting permissions to be re-established for his 18-year daily workflow. By 9:23 that morning, his calendar pinged with an invitation titled Operational Transition Overview in Conference Room Aspen. Julian Mercer entered 10 minutes late, carrying a steamy coffee for himself. Julian perched casually on the mahogany conference table. "We are moving at incredible speed, Edward," Julian began. "Massive changes ahead. Streamlining operational reporting occasionally requires reassigning administrative oversight, nothing personal." Edward asked who was assuming responsibility for retention compliance. Julian smiled brightly and named young Toby Miller. Toby Miller, who inquired last Thursday whether data sovereignty referred to an offshore cloud hosting platform, Edward asked in a steady voice. Julian's smile did not waver. We are simply building operational redundancy, Julian declared, adding a brief wink. After Julian left, Edward picked up his pen and wrote on his pad. This is not an operational transition. It is an active effort to scrub historical liability. That evening at home, Edward opened his personal laptop, an aging machine completely disconnected from the corporate network. He retrieved a silver external hard drive from his home safe, a battered device labeled Archive. For months, Edward had been conducting a meticulous backup of every critical document he authored or received. It was not a chaotic data dump, but a surgical extraction. He verified timestamps, cryptographic signatures, email header routing, and official board attachments, omitting informal banter and preserving final regulatory filings, policy deviation requests, and unrecorded approvals. He organized the archive into subdirectories, retention exceptions, unhedged liabilities, unauthorized vendor overrides, and verbal approvals. He maintained an index spreadsheet with direct hash cross-references to the exact server locations on the corporate network. By 1:42 in the morning, he completed the verification of the fifth master folder. His eyes burned and his shoulders throbbed, but the deep unease in his chest had crystallized into absolute clarity. Executive management was attempting to drag a heavy mop over their own financial footprints, and Edward had no intention of letting them erase the historical record. On Tuesday, Edward met with Toby Miller to facilitate what management termed a smooth knowledge transfer. Edward spent 4 hours demonstrating how to cross-reference vendor compliance certificates against federal regulatory databases, how to flag missing documentation, and how to interpret legal's ambiguous email phrasing. But every evening before leaving his desk, Edward slid a small USB drive into his pocket containing digital copies of the work orders he had processed that day. On Wednesday morning, HR lead Nora Finch scheduled a mandatory meeting titled Career Alignment Discussion, expressing a desire to explore how Edward's skill set might shine within the new framework. Translation: prepare your departure. Edward accepted the invitation and printed a detailed summary sheet titled Flagged High-Risk Vendor Exceptions, Fiscal Quarter 1 through Quarter 3, folding it into his briefcase. Later that afternoon, Edward walked into the executive kitchenette, while Julian Mercer was holding a bottle of craft beer imported for an upcoming merger celebration. When Julian raised his bottle in a mock toast to fresh beginnings, Edward offered a polite nod and replied, "To clean exits." The formal termination occurred at precisely 9:14 in the morning on Thursday. The morning was gray, with fluorescent lights flickering overhead. The calendar invitation had arrived at 8:03 with the subject line, Urgent Staffing Realignment. Edward knew the outcome before opening the message because his electronic badge had hesitated at the turnstile, flashing yellow twice before releasing the gate. The meeting took place in Conference Room Aspen. Nora Finch from Human Resources sat in the center of the long glass table, flanked by Genevieve Reed from Legal Counsel and a junior operations lead. "Thank you for making time, Edward," Nora began, sliding a thin blue folder across the table. "This will be a brief administrative discussion." Nora cleared her throat and read from a prepared script regarding the ongoing organizational realignment ahead of the merger with Vanguard Global Holdings. As a result, several legacy operational roles. Legacy, Edward thought silently, including senior risk oversight, have been evaluated for structural redundancy. Your position will be formally dissolved effective at 10 o'clock this morning. The word dissolved brought to mind acid consuming solid metal. Edward did not flinch. "Understood," he said in an even voice. Nora turned the page. "Your severance package includes 4 months of base salary continuation, full medical coverage extension, and a mandatory 6-month non-disclosure agreement covering all proprietary knowledge and pre-merger activities." 6 months, Edward observed quietly. "An interesting duration." "It is standard corporate procedure," Genevieve interjected. "It is strategic," Edward corrected. "The merger with Vanguard Global closes in precisely 7 weeks. Nora resumed reading. "Electronic system access will be terminated within the next few minutes. Facilities personnel will gather your personal belongings and ship them to your address." A polite knock sounded at the door where a maintenance worker stood holding a cardboard box. "That will not be necessary," Edward stated firmly. "I will collect my desk items and depart unescorted." Nora glanced at Genevieve, who gave a brief nod. Edward folded his hands. "You have already wiped my workstation files, have you not?" A brief flicker of surprise crossed Genevieve's face. "Standard IT protocol upon role dissolution," Nora stated smoothly. Edward smiled faintly. "You pulled the plug while I was actively editing the Q3 audit report. I was typing an addendum regarding vendor compliance when the calendar invite arrived. When I attempted to save, the system returned a permission error. You terminated access before the notification was delivered." Genevieve straightened her jacket, repeating that it was standard protocol. Edward stood up slowly, gathered his pen, and picked up the folder. "I understand completely," he said. "No access, no network footprint, no internal record." Nora attempted a professional smile. "We deeply appreciate your years of service." Edward looked directly into Genevieve's eyes. "Do not mistake professional composure for compliance." He walked out of conference room Aspen without making a sound, refusing to give management an emotional outburst to hide behind. He walked down the corridor with his chin up and his back straight. He had built the compliance infrastructure of this firm brick by brick. He knew which vendors had failed security audits, which executives had authorized unhedged liabilities, and which legal memos had been suppressed. He was the living memory of the organization, and management was acting as though memory were a dangerous disease. At his desk, his monitors were dark. A cardboard box sat beside his chair, containing his label maker, highlighters, coffee mug, and a framed photograph of his late wife. None of his immediate colleagues met his gaze. They had all received the broadcast email thanking Edward for his contributions. Edward lifted the box, took one final look at the quiet cubicles, and walked toward the elevator. As the doors slid shut, his personal phone vibrated with a text from his brother-in-law, Dwight Miller, asking if they were still meeting for dinner on Friday. Edward typed a brief reply, "Absolutely. I have complete open availability now." The elevator descended in silence, the quiet click inside his chest, transforming into unshakable resolve. Edward placed the cardboard box in his hallway closet, fed his cat, and opened his personal laptop at the kitchen table. 4 months earlier, he had sent himself an encrypted file attachment titled Q3 Risk Register, Master Verified Record, accompanied by a note, in the event of catastrophic institutional memory loss. He downloaded the document, displaying thousands of rows of itemized operational data recorded across his career. There were columns for incident date, responsible department, specific policy violation, vendor liability, financial exposure, regulatory risk level, and resolution status. Under resolution status, almost every entry regarding recent operations read the same word: ignored. A few entries read deferred by management, but the vast majority were simply blank, indicating complete executive inaction. He scrolled down to row 114. An unauthorized contract expansion with an overseas data broker lacking mandatory encryption protocols. Edward had flagged the violation in June, reflagged it in August, and received a verbal brush-off from Julian Mercer, who had declared that no one would care about compliance technicalities once the merger closed. Edward opened his supporting archive directory, finding complete email chains, high-resolution screenshots, and the pivotal message where Julian forwarded Edward's warning to Genevieve Reed asking, "Can we quietly suppress this item? It looks terrible for diligence." Genevieve's reply was equally clear: "Do not circulate version 2. If questioned by auditors, reference Legacy Framework, version 3. Edward studied those messages for several minutes, feeling neither shock nor disappointment. It was simply documented reality. He opened a fresh document and typed a bold header: Comprehensive Q3 Risk Register, Formal Regulatory Submission. Beneath the title, he added, "Prepared by Edward Vance, former Senior Risk Officer, verified hash timestamp attached. Distribution: Board of Directors and External Diligence Committee. Primary ground: material suppression of liabilities and breach of fiduciary duty." Throughout the night, Edward worked with surgical precision, creating a master dossier titled Supporting Legal Exhibits, matching every itemized risk entry to its corresponding email header, server log, or legal memorandum. Every claim was backed by an unbroken chain of custody. At 2 o'clock in the morning, he paused and stepped onto his porch. The city lights stretched out in the dark distance. Edward felt exceptionally calm, his heartbeat slow and steady. The frustration that had built up over months had burned away, leaving behind the cold focus of an auditor finishing a mandatory review. He contacted his brother-in-law, Dwight Miller, a retired federal compliance attorney, and transmitted an encrypted copy of the master file. Dwight called back, 20 minutes later, his voice heavy with astonishment. "Edward, this is not mere administrative negligence," Dwight said firmly. "This is systemic fraud, intentional concealment of material liabilities prior to an acquisition, and direct non-compliance with Sarbanes-Oxley Section 404. If executive management suppressed these documents while submitting diligence certifications to Vanguard Global Holdings, they have committed severe corporate forgery and breached their fiduciary duties to shareholders. You have undeniable proof here." Edward sat back in his chair and replied, "I know. I documented every single step." Dwight asked if Edward intended to file an immediate regulatory complaint. Edward explained his strategy. "I will submit the complete dossier directly to the board of directors and the acquiring firm's diligence team at precisely 5 o'clock and 1 minute in the afternoon on the exact day my severance non-disclosure agreement expires." Over the next several weeks, Edward watched from afar as Apex Financial Technologies published updates on social media featuring Julian Mercer celebrating the merger under captions like "seamless transition" and "zero legacy debt." Edward quietly saved each post into an exhibit folder titled "Public Misrepresentations." Meanwhile, internal contacts informed Edward that management was frantically attempting to cover their tracks. The retention compliance repository had been wiped, and all historical audit logs authored by Edward were deleted from shared servers. Junior analyst Toby Miller was presenting Edward's proprietary risk monitoring framework as his own creation. Edward merely noted the theft under Section 106 of Title 17 of the United States Code, securing copyright documentation for his original compliance methodology. At 2:01 in the morning on a Tuesday, 3 weeks before the NDA expiration, Edward received an automated alert from a secure honeypot link embedded within a cached backup file on the network. Someone using an administrative login assigned to Julian Mercer had accessed the server directory, downloaded Edward's original draft risk report, and overwritten it with a sanitized version that stripped out vendor liabilities and erased Edward's name as author, replacing it with compliance admin. However, the system's cryptographic SHA-256 hash immediately flagged the modification. The original hash and the altered hash did not match, creating digital proof of intentional metadata forgery. Edward took high-resolution screenshots of the hash mismatch, generated a cryptographic verification certificate, and labeled it Exhibit G, evidence of post-termination metadata alteration and corporate forgery. He compiled the entire body of evidence into a single master PDF file containing 67 pages of itemized documentation, supported by cloud-hosted exhibit links backed by immutable blockchain timestamps. He drafted a formal cover letter to Chairman Alistair Thorne and the executive board of Vanguard Global Holdings, stating that management had systematically misinformed them regarding operational liabilities. He set an automated email dispatch trigger for 5 o'clock and 1 minute in the afternoon on the exact date his 6-month NDA lapsed. The day of reckoning arrived under a clear autumn sky. At 4:58 in the afternoon, Edward sat at the dining table of a small lakeside cabin he had rented for the week, far away from the corporate towers of the city. A warm mug of tea sat beside his personal laptop where a digital countdown timer ticked toward 5:01 p.m. Across town on the 18th floor of corporate headquarters, Chairman Alistair Thorne was presiding over a formal joint board meeting with executive leadership of Vanguard Global Holdings. The atmosphere in the glass boardroom was celebratory. Julian Mercer was standing near a large digital display, presenting the final slide of his diligence deck, which featured the phrase "zero legacy liabilities, fully streamlined operational risk." Chairman Thorne smiled broadly, raising his glass of sparkling water to toast the acquiring board members. At precisely 5 o'clock and 1 minute in the afternoon, the automated dispatch protocol executed, Edward's master email left his offsite secure server and hit the high-priority inboxes of Chairman Thorne, every member of the Apex Board of Directors, the Chief Risk Officer of Vanguard Global Holdings, and the Federal Regulatory Compliance Portal simultaneously. In the corporate boardroom, Chairman Thorne's laptop emitted a sharp high-priority chime. He glanced down at his screen, expecting a routine confirmation from legal. Instead, he saw a subject line that made his thumb pause over the trackpad. Ignored warnings, comprehensive Q3 risk register, and evidentiary submission. Beneath the subject line was a single sentence. Executive management has provided falsified diligence representations. Enclosed is the hash-verified compliance record. Chairman Thorne opened the attached 67-page PDF document. The first page displayed a formal affidavit signed by Edward Vance, backed by SHA 256 cryptographic hashes and open timestamp certificates. Below the header was an itemized master table detailing $45 million in unhedged foreign vendor liabilities, unencrypted data transfers violating federal privacy statutes, and direct logs proving that Julian Mercer and Genevieve Reed had ordered the destruction of audit trails. Page 14 contained high-resolution screenshots of the metadata alteration, executed at 2:01 in the morning, proving deliberate corporate forgery and breach of fiduciary duty. As Chairman Thorne scrolled through the first 5 pages, the color drained entirely from his face. His confident smile vanished, replaced by sheer horror. The acquiring lead from Vanguard Global, noticing the sudden silence, asked if everything was all right with the closing documentation. Chairman Thorne did not answer. His hand trembled slightly as he reached out and pressed the mute button on the central conference phone. He turned to his executive assistant, sitting in the corner of the boardroom, his voice cracking with panic. "Get legal on the line immediately," Thorne stammered, his eyes glued to the damning evidence on his screen. "Find Genevieve Reed, get Julian Mercer into this room right now, and find out where Edward Vance is." Within minutes, the executive floor erupted into total chaos. The acquiring board of Vanguard Global immediately suspended the merger negotiations impending a full federal forensic audit. Regulatory agencies were automatically notified by the server dispatch, triggering formal investigations under Sarbanes-Oxley Section 404 and federal whistleblower protection laws. Julian Mercer and Genevieve Reed were placed on immediate administrative leave as corporate legal counsel scrambled to assess their personal criminal liability for evidence tampering and corporate forgery. At his quiet lakeside cabin, Edward's personal phone began buzzing continuously at 5:07 in the afternoon. Unknown numbers, frantic text messages from former colleagues, urgent voicemail alerts from corporate legal representatives, and emails from federal regulatory investigators flooded his screen. Edward looked at the vibrating phone, picked it up with a calm hand, and flipped it face down on the wooden table. He did not need to answer their calls. He had spent 18 years speaking to them through clear, precise, documented compliance warnings that they had chosen to shred and ignore. Now, his 67-page verified dossier was speaking for him in a language that no executive could silence, alter, or erase. He walked out onto the wooden porch, inhaled the crisp evening air, and watched the calm waters of the lake reflect the fading light of sunset. The floor beneath his feet was completely solid, and for the first time in many years, the air was entirely clean.